Welcome to Sunday School Lesson at a Glance, a ministry of the Sunday School Publishing Board, where we focus on teaching, engaging, application, and learning for teachers and students.
I will be sharing highlights and key points from the Adult Faith Pathway Bible Study Sunday School book and the Townsend Press Sunday School Commentary based on the International Lesson Series. We're in the winter quarter of Sunday School lessons, and the title of this quarter study is Justice, Law, and History. The study this quarter focuses on justice as presented in a variety of Old Testament scriptures. We are in Unit 2 entitled God, the Source of Justice. The lessons in this unit focus on God's justice in the lives of His people and in the gift of the law. Can you imagine what it would be like to live in a society without rules, laws, and regulations? God knows if a society is to function properly, there must be order in a society. If not, there will be destruction and injustice. In this week's lesson, God outlines civic and religious laws that govern and ensure the establishment of a lawful and just society. Get your Sunday school book, Bible, notepad, pen, or device, and follow along as we take a glimpse into this week's Sunday school lesson. Now let's get started with this wonderful lesson. The lesson title for this week, January the 16th, is Unbiased Actions. And this is the title in the adult book. The title in the Sunday school commentary is The Law of Justice and Mercy. The background scripture is Exodus chapter 23, and the print passage is Exodus chapter 23, verses 1 through 12. The key verse in this week's lesson is, do not follow the crowd in doing wrong. When you give testimony in a lawsuit, do not pervert justice by siding with the crowd, and do not show favoritism to a poor person in a lawsuit. And that's Exodus chapter 23, verse 2 and 3 in the New International Version. Here are some questions to consider and reflect on as we go through this week's lesson. Question number 1. What are believers expected to do in their dealings with others? Question number 2. What does God say about fair treatment of our enemies? And question number 3. What is God teaching us about the Sabbath day and the Sabbath year? Let's take a brief look at the lesson biblical context. This week's lesson is in the book of Exodus. The context of this lesson is the section of Exodus that deals with the laws that God gave Israel that dealt with governing every aspect of her relationship with Him and with each other. The 10 Commandments were the foundation of all other civic and religious laws that God gave Israel to ensure that they established a just society. God dictated the laws Moses gave to the people. The events in this week's lesson take place during the first year of Israel's liberation from bondage in Egypt. It was during this time that these laws were established. The 10 Commandments were God's instructions that were to govern Israel's covenant relationship with Him and with each other. The first 4 commandments detail the basis of this relationship. And we see this in Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 through 11. God expected Israel to acknowledge and obey Him because of who He is. The last 6 commandments, and we find them in Exodus chapter 20, verses 12 through 17, spell out the requirements for and responsibilities to family, neighbors, and communities. Living as God expected was to be vertical. In other words, honoring God, and then horizontal, honoring others. A proper relationship with God determines how we relate to each other. Exodus chapter 21 through chapter 23 expands on and applies the 10 commandments to particular situations. The laws presented in Exodus chapter 23, verses 1 through 12, which is in our lesson text, apply to the 9th commandment. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. And that's Exodus chapter 20, verse 16. In other words, prohibiting bearing false witness. And the 4th commandment regarding the Sabbath, and that's in Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. Specific principles that detail how to execute justice and mercy in Israel's courts and toward neighbors is presented in Exodus chapter 23, verses 1 through 9. And the proper observance of the Sabbath is presented in Exodus chapter 23, verses 10 through 12. The focus on Sabbath expands to include principles governing the use of land as a blessing to the poor and animals, and we will see this in our lesson. These laws were intended to ensure that justice was equally applied to all people within the Hebrew community. The basis for the 10 commandments and each of these laws are still essential for a just society today. The lesson aims for this week are: number 1, remember that God expects believers to care for others. The second lesson aim is aspire to be impartial in showing justice and mercy. And the third lesson aim is practice helping those who are in need. As we continue our glimpse into this week's lesson, I'm going to share 2 key points from each outline in the lesson text and expound some on each one. There are 3 outlines presented in the Adult Faith Pathway Sunday School book. The first outline is Uphold the Truth, and that's Exodus chapter 23, verses 1 through 3. The second lesson outline is Fair Treatment for All, and that's Exodus chapter 23, verses 4 through 9. And the third lesson outline is Justice and the Sabbath, and that's Exodus chapter 23, verses 10 through 12. Let's begin our analysis of the biblical text with the first lesson outline, Uphold the Truth. Verse 1 reads, do not spread false reports. Do not help a guilty person by being a malicious witness. Verse 1 begins with a command or a law against bearing false witness. In other words, forbidding members of the community from passing along false and baseless claims about others. Here, the reference is to spreading rumors and claims that are not true. The 9th commandment, Exodus chapter 20, verse 16 reads, you shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. It could simply read, do not lie. We are not to give out false information on another person. And in a courtroom situation, we are not to lie under oath. In other words, do not be an unrighteous witness. Key point number 1. Believers are expected to tell the truth at all times and in all situations. We are to tell the truth, not spread lies about others. We are not to slander others and share misinformation about others. The law forbids talebearers from knowingly reporting false and meritless information. When believers slander, gossip, sow ideas intended to harm others, share others' faults, and attempt to deceive others for gain or profit, they are guilty of bearing false witness. Further, the law forbids even persons joining with others to spread untruths. This included every form associated with bearing false witnesses against others, especially in the exercise of justice. These laws were given so that those charged with carrying out justice could ensure that no deception invaded the process. These verses deal with judicial matters and regulations. As a developing nation, Israel needed to understand the importance of a legal system free of unbiased judgments if they expected to please God and to prosper. Israel was forbidden to give false testimony, to slander the innocent, or free the guilty. In God's sight, lying is never acceptable. It is a serious transgression when used as the basis of perverted justice. A key point to remember is that bearing false witness or lying can take the forms of malicious gossip and deception that we should refrain from. This set of laws was written, again, to prevent individuals from damaging people's names, reputations by spreading falsehoods. One must always evaluate the source of the information and investigate to determine whether something is true before taking action on it. The spread of malicious rumors through a congregation can do extreme harm, that is, in most cases, and can never be repaired. Verse 2 reads, "Do not follow the crowd in doing wrong. When you give testimony in a lawsuit, do not pervert justice by siding with the crowd." Verse 2 is the second law that called upon the people not to align themselves and follow the multitude in committing evil. The law acknowledges that the crowd is not always right. God instructed them to refuse being swayed by the views of the majority and conspiring with others to subvert justice. In other words, again, do not accept bribes or falsify evidence. We are to be honest in all of our dealings. Verse 3, "And do not show favoritism to a poor person in a lawsuit." Key point number 2, partiality and favoritism are wrong, regardless of who is the recipient. A poor man should not be shown favoritism just because he is poor, and we should not judge against the poor man because he is poor. We are to treat people with integrity, regardless of what their social economic status might be. In other words, you don't favor the poor and you don't rule against the poor. In verse 3, God forbade showing favoritism to the poor in a lawsuit if they were guilty simply because of their poverty. The second outline, fair treatment for all. God's requirement to practice unbiased actions and attitudes extended beyond Israel's legal system. He commanded the fair treatment of their enemies as well. Verse 4 reads, "If you come across your enemy's ox or donkey wandering off, be sure to return it." Verse 5, "If you see the donkey of someone who hates you falling down under its load, do not leave it there. Be sure you help them with it." Key point number 1, we are to help our enemies in their time of need. The expectation, as we read in verses 4 and 5, was not to withhold justice nor take revenge on their livestock. Believers are to avoid the "you kill my dog, I'll kill your cat" payback mentality. This particular law required returning an enemy's lost property if found and helping that person as needed. Helping an enemy is difficult sometimes, but it is expected of believers. The Bible tells us that we should pray for our enemies and do good to those who despitefully use us. Matthew chapter 5, verse 44 in the King James Version reads, "But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you." Yes, We should do good to those who despitefully use us. We are not to be revengeful and hold hostility. Verse 6 reads, do not deny justice to your poor people in their lawsuits. And verse 7 reads, have nothing to do with a false charge, and do not put an innocent or honest person to death, for I will acquit the guilty. Verses 6 and 7 prohibit bias against the poor. The poor were never to be denied justice or falsely charged. Verse 8 reads, do not accept a bribe, for a bribe blinds those who see and twists the words of the innocent. And verse 9 reads, do not oppress a foreigner. You yourselves know how it feels to be foreigners, because you were foreigners in Egypt. Verse 9 states the law that reminded Israel of their 430-year slave history, and therefore commanded them not to become an oppressor against anyone. He is saying, remember how you felt when you were a stranger. Surely a group of former slaves could understand the injustice of living in bondage. Key point number 2, be careful how you treat a stranger. The law was intended to arouse a deep sense of compassion for the stranger, the person who was a foreigner among them. The Hebrew people were commanded by God to apply the law without prejudice. Fair treatment, regardless of race, gender, appearance, social status, and education, should always be the goal of a free society. Israel was repeatedly reminded of her oppressive experiences as strangers and slaves in Egypt, and this was to motivate her to show compassion and empathy to strangers in her midst. These principles were commands to Israel, but apply to believers today. Third outline, justice and the Sabbath. Key point number 1, God teaches about rest and compassion for the less fortunate, others, and the animals. Verse 10 reads, for 6 years you are to sow your fields and harvest the crops. Verse 11 reads, but during the 7th year, let the land lie unplowed and unused. Then the poor among your people may get food from it, and the wild animals may eat what is left. Do the same with your vineyard and your olive grove. Verse 12 reads, 6 days do your work, but on the 7th day do not work, so that your ox and your donkey may rest, and so that the slave born in your household and the foreigner living among you may be refreshed. Key point number 2, God institutes a Sabbath day and a Sabbath year. 2 Sabbaths were observed, the Sabbath year and the Sabbath day. Israel was instructed to cultivate the land for 6 years and let it rest the 7th year, and this was called the 7th year. The purpose of this requirement was twofold. It was to allow the land to rest, to go unplowed and unused, and was to allow the soil so the soil could rest and replenish. The second purpose was to provide free access to food for the poor and for the wild animals. In addition, this law required a weekly Sabbath or day of rest, not only for the nation, but also for their slaves, strangers, and work animals. Everything that came up naturally was to be shared with them during the Sabbath year. The purpose of the Sabbath rest was about more than being idle or just taking a break from work. Israel's Sabbath was holy and intended to be a day of compassion toward and to focus on the emotional well-being of Israel's slaves, the strangers among them, and their work animals. In summary, today's society is diseased with bearing false witness at all levels, even among Christians. Lying is a specific sin that God hates. Tell the truth Do not spread false reports. Do not follow the crowd in doing wrong. Do not show favoritism to and against the poor. Help our enemies when they are in a difficult situation. Show compassion to strangers and others. Treat the poor fairly and do not accept bribes. These are all laws outlined in this week's lesson, and also they apply to believers today as well. Instances of unfair bias with judicial systems, perversion of justice for specific segments of society, and the lack of compassion for the poor and oppressed are all alive and well now. The content in this week's lesson teaches God's requirements for believers if a just society is to be maintained. God intended that Israel learn to be compassionate toward the less fortunate, the common laborers, and the animal life he created. Every area of life, civil and religious, is to be guided by God's principles of justice. Thank you for tuning in to Sunday School Lesson at a Glance. I hope this glimpse of this week's Sunday School lesson is helpful to you as you prepare to teach and study God's Word. Don't forget to click the like, share, and subscribe button. For additional information and resources, contact the Sunday School Publishing Board. Blessings to you until the next Sunday School Lesson at a Glance.
We invite you to join us each week as we take a glimpse into the Sunday School lesson. Subscribe now.